The moment you realize you're no longer a part of your family isn't marked by loud words or grand gestures. It's the silence that follows, the absence of your name in conversations where it once belonged. The kitchen hums with the sound of the microwave, the soft thud of a door closing, but to her, it's deafening. She stands by the counter, stirring the coffee she's prepared for the family, but none of them will drink it. The mug, once filled with laughter and casual conversation, now sits alone on the counter, untouched. Her hands linger on the edge of the counter, fingers tracing the smooth surface, but there's no warmth in the action. There's no longer any connection to this home, to these people who once filled her with purpose. The room feels too wide, too empty now. Her breath catches in her chest, but she doesn't let it out. She knows better than to let the cracks show. Her eyes move to the door where her mother-in-law is speaking softly with her sister-in-law, her words carrying through the room like a soft wind, but none of them reach her. They don't even notice she's still standing there, waiting. The silence deepens. In the past, she would have been called in to join the conversation, her voice valued, her presence felt. But today, she's a shadow, an accessory to a family moment she no longer belongs to. She shifts her weight slightly, still holding the cup, but her grip weakens as her mind drifts back. There were moments, countless moments, when her contributions were swallowed whole, buried beneath the weight of their expectations. The years spent helping, supporting, doing everything that was needed, all while never being seen. She remembers the times when she cooked meals for them, staying up late to prepare the house, to please them. She remembers the quiet disappointment in her mother-in-law's eyes when she failed to meet some unseen standard, the disapproving sighs when she didn't get it right, the absence of praise when she did. Her mind flashes back to her own mother, who used to tell her, "You're good enough just as you are," but now, she no longer feels that reassurance. It feels like a distant echo. She was always the one to compromise, to make sure everyone else was comfortable, to hold things together, even when it meant sacrificing pieces of herself. And still, she was never enough. She isn't enough now. Her body is heavy, burdened with the weight of these realizations, but she doesn't move. She remains in her spot, as if rooted to the floor, her breath shallow. The cup clinks against the counter when her hand finally releases it, but the sound is small, insignificant. There's no anger in her, only a quiet, devastating acceptance. The family has moved on without her, and there's no room left for her in this house, in this life. She was always just a figure on the edge, someone who could be relied on but never truly seen. The realization settles in her chest like a stone, and for the first time in years, she feels the full weight of her displacement. She's not part of them anymore. She doesn't belong. And the worst part is, she never truly did. There is no place for her here. The family is complete without her. She isn't even missed. She watches as her mother-in-law places a hand on her sister-in-law's arm, and the gesture is enough to sever any remaining thread of connection. The sharpness of the loss cuts deeper than any words could. She swallows hard, but there's no fight left in her. She doesn't call out. She doesn't beg for recognition. She simply turns away. The door closes quietly behind her as she steps into the hallway, her footsteps almost silent, as if she's already a ghost. It's a quiet retreat, a surrender to the space she's carved out for herself, on the outside, where the family no longer lives. The family gathers around the table once again, the same table where laughter and light once filled the air. But today, the warmth is missing. She enters the room quietly, her footsteps barely making a sound, as if she's trying to avoid being noticed, trying to shrink into the background. The others are already seated, engaged in conversation, but it's the kind of conversation that happens over her, not with her. She stands at the doorway, holding a plate of food she's prepared with care, but no one looks up. The chair at the head of the table, the one that used to be hers, is empty. It's been claimed by her mother-in-law, who sits at the center, her eyes gleaming with authority, her posture perfectly composed. The younger daughter-in-law, too, is positioned at the other end, talking in soft, careful tones, clearly seeking approval. She hesitates, unsure where to place herself. The only seat left is on the edge, at the far side, out of view. It's the seat for the outsider. She sets the plate down on the counter, the clink of it against the surface a reminder of her insignificance. No one notices. She watches, her eyes tracing the subtle shifts in the room. The The way her mother-in-law's hand rests on her daughter-in-law's arm, a silent confirmation of her dominance. She catches the faintest glance, but it's not directed at her. It's a passing glance, a glance that acknowledges her presence only enough to confirm that she's still in the room, still visible, but not important. The subtle snub isn't loud. It's the quietest kind of rejection, but it stings nonetheless. The silence that follows feels heavy, thick with unsaid words. As she slowly makes her way to the farthest seat, she can't help but notice how her space has been diminished. The chair she takes is small, wedged between the edge of the table and a tall lamp, far away from the others. It feels like a place left for someone who is tolerated, not included. The clinking of silverware fills the air, but no one speaks directly to her. The conversation flows between the others, their words flowing easily, but they seem to bypass her. She's no longer the one they seek out for an opinion, for validation, for connection. Her voice, once heard, is now silenced by the simple act of being overlooked. The plate of food, which she had hoped would spark some interaction, sits cold. She picks at it slowly, mechanically, her fork scraping against the plate, but the action feels hollow. It's a ritual, not a meal. She realizes that they've stopped looking to her for anything. Her presence is an afterthought, a background detail that no one bothers to address. Even when she speaks, her words fade into the background, unnoticed, unheard. It's the quietest kind of humiliation, one that doesn't need words to be felt. It's in the silence, in the way she's excluded without a word being said. Her eyes drift down to the table, to the empty spaces where she used to belong, where her name once had weight. But now, it's as if she's invisible, her very existence. Dismissed. She reaches for the salt shaker, but her hand trembles slightly, the smallest indication of how far she's been pushed out. She knows she's no longer part of the center. She's on the edge now, not even a peripheral figure in this family gathering. The space around her feels vast, too large for someone who once held a place at its heart. She recalls the first time she realized she wasn't truly a part of the family anymore. It wasn't a loud moment, no harsh words or arguments. It was in the subtle shift, the quiet exclusion. It was a Sunday afternoon, and the family had gathered in the living room, everyone there for the usual ritual of afternoon tea. The table was set, just like it always had been, with mismatched cups and saucers, the steam from the teapot curling into the air, filling the room with a comforting warmth. She had walked in, freshly prepared for the occasion, hoping for a small conversation, a moment of connection. Her mother-in-law, however, didn't look up. Neither did her sister-in-law. Her husband gave her a quick, almost absent smile as he shifted to make room for her at the table. But there was no invitation to sit close. No pulling out the chair with a welcoming gesture like there used to be. The seat was farthest from the group, an obvious space left empty between her and the others. She tried not to notice it, tried to dismiss the feeling that her presence was simply tolerated, not wanted. But as she sat down, the quietness of it struck her deeply. She could feel the weight of the absence more than ever. Her mother-in-law, who used to make space for her with an affectionate gesture, now only looked at her from the corner of her eye, never quite meeting her gaze. As the conversation carried on, she tried to engage, commenting on the news of the week, but the words seemed to fall flat. No one responded with more than a passing acknowledgement. Her mother-in-law went on to tell a story, but it wasn't about her. It was about her daughter-in-law, the one who had just recently returned from a trip, the one who was the center of the conversation. She listened to the praises being heaped upon her sister-in-law, how she had planned everything so perfectly, how everyone had enjoyed their time with her. As her mother-in-law spoke, there was a moment when she looked over at her, a brief flicker of something in her eyes, but it was gone too quickly to decipher. Was it recognition? Or just a passing glance that saw her as nothing more than an extra in a scene she had once been central to? She recalled how, in the past, when the family had gathered like this, there had been an effort to include her, to ask her about her day, to make her feel like she was part of something bigger. But now, it felt as though she was invisible. Her contributions, her sacrifices, were no longer acknowledged. It was as if the family had gradually stopped seeing her. The once vibrant conversations she had shared with her mother-in-law, where they exchanged looks of understanding and shared jokes, had now become one-sided. She had given up so much over the years, little by little, until the void between them was too wide to cross. She had thought she belonged, that her place was secure in this family, but now she was merely an observer, watching the family dynamic unfold without a true role in it. There was no confrontation, no declaration of exclusion. It was just in the way she was looked at, in the way her words didn't quite matter anymore. It was in the way she had to accept her seat at the edge of the table, a silent reflection of her own diminishing significance. And as the afternoon wore on, she found herself sitting there, the warmth of the tea fading, her own presence beginning to feel like a burden. She had once been at the heart of this, part of the lively conversation, the shared laughter. Now, she was merely an afterthought, a shadow lingering on the outskirts of the family she had once been so deeply a part of. It was another quiet evening, the kind that seemed like any other, yet the weight of the moment hung heavily in the air. The family had gathered for dinner again, just like always. The kitchen was warm with the smell of freshly baked bread, the clinking of utensils filling the otherwise still room. She entered, carrying a dish she had prepared herself, her hand steady, though her mind was already drifting. She placed the dish on the table, hoping for some small acknowledgement, for some recognition of the effort she had made. But as she set it down, she noticed how everyone had already started, how her seat remained at the far end of the table, untouched. The small, polite smiles came, but they didn't meet her eyes. Her mother-in-law spoke first, her voice soft, almost too soft, as if she were speaking through a veil. "Oh, this looks lovely," she said, but there was no real warmth in her tone, just the formality of expected words. Her daughter-in-law nodded in agreement, but the glance she shared with her mother-in-law was enough to tell the unspoken truth. They were already engaged in their own conversation, one that didn't include her. The chair at the end of the table was too far, too isolated, but she sat anyway, without protest. The conversation continued, but it wasn't directed at her. It never was anymore. She could feel the subtle shift in the air, the space between them growing ever wider. Her daughter-in-law, now comfortably at the center of the family, filled the silence with her stories from a recent vacation, her voice light and carefree. Her mother-in-law smiled, a wide smile, at every word, nodding as though everything her daughter-in-law said was the most important thing in the world. She watched, her fork halfway to her mouth, but the food felt like sawdust in her mouth. She chewed slowly, pretending to be part of this moment, pretending to be part of this family. But her presence wasn't needed. The weight of it was crushing, but she couldn't show it. She couldn't speak it. There was nothing to say. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned to plans for the upcoming holidays. Her mother-in-law and daughter-in-law spoke about who would be cooking, who would be in charge of organizing. She was silent, her eyes downcast, focused on the pattern in the napkin in front of her, as if it might hold some answer she couldn't find anywhere else. She had always taken charge of the holidays before, had always been the one to make sure everything was perfect, but now she was relegated to the sidelines. There was no direct confrontation, no harsh words exchanged. It was all done in the small gestures, the careful avoidance, the way her contributions were gently overlooked, as though they had never mattered. She felt her chest tighten, but she didn't speak up. She never did. She didn't want to cause a scene. She didn't want to seem petty. So, she sat there, invisible, while they continued to discuss the plans without her. The night carried on, and as the dishes were cleared away, she stayed at the table, still holding onto the illusion of belonging. But deep down, she knew it was a lie. She was no longer part of this. She was no longer central to the family. Her seat at the table, once a place of pride, had become a reminder of her exclusion. The subtle humiliation was there in the quiet, in the looks that weren't quite meant for her, in the space that was no longer hers. She didn't confront them. She didn't raise her voice. She simply took her leave, excusing herself without making a fuss. She went to the bedroom and closed the door, as if the room could somehow shield her from the reality she wasn't ready to face. It wasn't the first time she had felt this way, but it was the first time it had become so undeniable. She was being replaced, not with force, but with indifference. And the hardest part was knowing that she couldn't blame anyone specifically. It wasn't a deliberate act of cruelty. It was the quiet, accumulated weight of neglect, the slow erasure of her place in this family. She had given so much of herself, and yet, it had all been taken for granted. She wasn't seen, not anymore. She wasn't needed. And somehow, that hurt more than anything she had ever faced. It wasn't until the will was read that she fully understood. The lawyer's office was cold, its sterile walls offering no comfort, and the paper on the table in front of her felt like a slap, an irreversible fact. Her mother-in-law and her sister-in-law sat across from her, their faces masked with polite expressions, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. The lawyer's voice was the only sound that seemed to cut through the thick silence. "And for the family home," he said, glancing at her briefly, "the property will be passed on to—" He paused, looking at the other two women. "To be jointly shared between Mrs. Holloway and her daughter." She froze. The words didn't immediately make sense. They couldn't. She had lived here for years, had been the one to maintain the house, to care for everything. Yet now she was being told that her name was nowhere to be found. She had thought, for a moment, that it was an oversight, a mistake. But no, it was clear now. The inheritance, the house that she had poured her life into, was never hers to begin with. It belonged to them. She could feel the pressure building in her chest, her fingers tightening on the edge of the chair. But she didn't say anything. She couldn't. The lawyer went on, his voice fading as she sat there, absorbing the full weight of the betrayal. She had known, on some level, that things had shifted, that her role had diminished over the years. But this was the confirmation. This was the proof that she had never truly belonged here, that her sacrifices and her years of service were nothing more than a tool for the others to use. Her contributions had been taken for granted, her love and devotion seen as nothing more than something to be exploited. The words continued to float around her, but she couldn't process them. All she could hear was the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall, a steady reminder that time had passed, that this moment had been years in the making. The lawyer asked if anyone had any questions, but she couldn't find her voice. Her husband sat there, his gaze fixed ahead, not once looking at her. It was as though she were invisible to him, as though she had always been invisible. She had been the one to sacrifice everything, to take on the responsibilities that others couldn't, but it was all for nothing. The coldness in the room was suffocating. She had thought, for so long, that the family loved her, that they appreciated her efforts, but now she could see it clearly. She was not a part of this family. She was the outsider, the one who was tolerated but never truly included. The small details had always been there. The way her mother-in-law would subtly take over every conversation. The way her sister-in-law would always dismiss her ideas. The way her husband had stopped seeing her a long time ago. But now, sitting in that room, she could see it all for what it was, a deliberate, orchestrated effort to push her out. To make her feel small, to ensure that she never had the power she thought she did. She couldn't even bring herself to cry. There was nothing left to say. She had been replaced. She had been discarded, and they had taken everything from her. But it wasn't just the house, it wasn't just the inheritance, it was her place in this family, the one thing she had clung to all these years. It had all been stripped away. She sat there, staring at the papers in front of her, her breath shallow, her mind numb. This was the moment when everything became clear. All the quiet rejections, all the subtle signs of exclusion, had been leading to this. She had been a pawn in a game she didn't know she was playing. And now, she was left with nothing but the hollow echo of a family that had never truly been hers. It happened in the middle of a quiet Sunday afternoon, when the weight of everything she had been suppressing finally came to a head. Her mother-in-law's voice, always so composed and commanding, broke through the calm as she spoke casually to her daughter-in-law, discussing plans for the upcoming family event. "We'll need your help setting things up," her mother-in-law said, looking directly at her daughter-in-law, not even glancing in her direction. She had been standing in the kitchen, silently chopping vegetables, but when she heard those words, it felt like a cold slap to the face. She had always been the one to organize these events, to ensure everything ran smoothly. Yet now, she was invisible. The realization hit her like a rush of cold air. She had been replaced. She had been pushed aside in favor of someone else, and no one even had the decency to acknowledge the shift. Her body froze. Her hands, still holding the knife, trembled slightly as she continued to slice through the vegetables, but her mind was elsewhere. The kitchen around her seemed distant now, as though she were looking through a foggy window, separated from the family that had once been hers. She had always thought that the family loved her, that her place was secure, But the truth was undeniable now. She wasn't needed anymore. The quiet snub had come in the form of a single sentence, a gesture that seemed so small, but it shattered everything. She could feel. Her chest tightened, but she didn't move. She didn't react. She simply stood there, frozen, as the conversation continued without her, the laughter and chatter flowing around her like a river she was no longer a part of. No one looked her way. No one asked if she wanted to join in. She was a ghost in her own home. As the minutes dragged on, the knife in her hand felt heavier. She set it down slowly, almost mechanically, and turned her back to the room, taking a deep breath. The air in the kitchen felt suffocating, thick with the weight of her own realization. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral, refusing to let the emotions rise to the surface. She wasn't going to beg for acknowledgement. She wasn't going to plead for her place in this family. She had done that for years, and it had never worked. This was different. She was different. Her place in this family had already been decided without her, and it wasn't at the table. She didn't need to scream, to argue, to confront them. The truth was clear now. She wasn't part of their plans. She wasn't needed anymore. She quietly walked away from the kitchen, leaving the conversation behind her, leaving the house behind her, though she knew she couldn't escape what had just become painfully clear. Her role in this family was no longer hers to claim. The weight of that truth sank in with each step, but she remained silent. No words, no outbursts. Just the simple act of walking away, the only response she had left. The days that followed were marked by an overwhelming silence, a silence that seemed to echo in every corner of the house. She moved through her routines as if in a daze, her actions automatic, her body on autopilot. The dishes were always clean, the laundry always folded, the house spotless, but none of it mattered. She no longer had the energy to care about the cleanliness or order she once took pride in. It was merely a task now, a distraction from the aching void inside her. She found herself sitting for long stretches of time, just staring at the walls of the living room, at the same pictures that once brought her comfort, now only reminding her of the emptiness that had replaced everything. She once knew. She would occasionally get up, her movements slow, deliberate, like she was wading through thick air. There was always something to clean, something to organize, something to take care of, but the more she did, the more she realized how small her role had become, how irrelevant her presence felt. The kitchen, once a place of warmth and conversation, now felt like a space she was merely occupying. She would stand at the counter, wiping it down over and over again, unable to escape the thought that it had once been hers to command, hers to control. Now, the seat at the table, the place where she once sat as an equal, was taken by others. It was always her mother-in-law's chair now, always her daughter-in-law's place in the conversation. She was no longer a part of the rhythm of the family. Her contributions, once so valued, had slipped through the cracks, replaced by the ease with which the others moved through their lives, without her. She would watch them, hear their laughter from the other room, but it felt like she was listening from a distance, like a stranger eavesdropping on a conversation she no longer belonged to. The walls, the floors, the pictures, they all felt foreign now. This house, once full of memories, now felt like a shell. Her name was no longer spoken with affection, no longer included in the plans, the discussions. She wasn't part of the future they were building, and the realization was too much to bear. But she kept going through the motions, kept up the appearances, even though deep down, she knew nothing would ever be the same again. She wasn't sure when it had happened, but she had already been replaced, and there was no going back. It wasn't a single moment, but a series of small, quiet moments that had added up to this place where she no longer belonged. She had been slowly erased, pushed out of the life she had once shared with them, and now, she was nothing more than a faint memory in the background. She didn't say anything, didn't protest. She didn't need to. The truth was clear. She was no longer a part of their world, no longer at the center of it all. She had been replaced, and the hardest part was knowing that no one would even notice when she was gone. She sat at the small desk in the corner of the room, the faint light from the window casting a soft glow across the paperwork in front of her. The house was quiet, too quiet, as though it were holding its breath, waiting. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately, as she pulled out the old documents, legal papers, financial statements, the deed to the house. She didn't look at them with the same sense of duty she once had. Now, there was only a cold, clinical detachment. The weight of the house, the responsibilities she had once carried so willingly, was no longer hers to bear. She ran a finger along the edges of the papers, tracing the outlines of what used to be her world, but now it all seemed distant, irrelevant. There were no more decisions to be made about the family gatherings, no more consultations about what to cook, no more discussions about who would sit where at the table. The roles had been handed out, and she no longer had one. The realization was sharp, but not painful, just true. She had been removed, and now, with quiet intent, she was preparing to reclaim what was hers, not by force or demand, but with a subtle shift in her stance. She didn't need their approval, their acknowledgement. She no longer cared to return to the place she once occupied. Instead, she began filling out the forms, the ones she had once avoided, the ones that felt like a betrayal of her former self. But now they were just steps, simple actions that needed to be taken. No drama, no confrontation. She didn't need to explain herself. There was no need for words. She had no intention of fighting for her place in this family anymore. She had already been replaced, and she had already moved on. The papers in front of her were not just legal documents. They were her plan, her decision, to sever the ties that had once bound her here. She could see it all so clearly now. The house, the inheritance, the family, none of it was hers anymore, not in the way she had once believed. She wasn't asking for a seat at the table, wasn't pleading for recognition. She was simply preparing to leave, not physically, but in every other sense. Her role in this family had already ended, and now, she was taking back control, quietly, privately. She stood up slowly, her eyes still on the papers, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something stir within her, a sense of clarity, a recognition of what was hers to claim. She folded the papers carefully and placed them into the drawer, locking them away. There was no need to announce it. The change had already happened, and with it came a quiet power. She wasn't returning to the role she once had. She wasn't seeking approval, and she wasn't looking back. She was moving forward, no longer defined by the family she had given so much to. The house, the memories, everything, was now just a part of her past. And as she closed the drawer, the soft click of the lock sounded like the closing of a chapter that no longer had a place for her. She stood by the window, the soft light filtering through the curtains as she looked out at the house that had once been the center of her life, but now felt so distant. Her eyes traced the familiar outlines of the garden, the driveway, the porch that had witnessed so many memories, but it no longer felt like home. With quiet precision, she began packing her things, each movement purposeful but calm. There was no urgency, no rush. She wasn't leaving out of anger or frustration. She was leaving because she no longer needed to be here. No longer needed to be tied to a place that had never truly embraced her. Her hands moved steadily, packing what was hers, nothing more. The photographs, the keepsakes, each item held a memory, but now, they were simply things, not the life she had once built around them. She closed the suitcase with a soft click, the sound not as final as it seemed, but it echoed in the room, reverberating through the air like the closing of a door she no longer needed to open. She moved through the house one last time, silently, carefully. She didn't need to say goodbye. The space already felt like it belonged to someone else. She reached for the door handle, pausing just for a moment. It wasn't the door that had changed, but her. She had already made her peace. The house would go on without her. The family would continue as they always had, but she no longer played a part in it. She wasn't angry. She wasn't sad. She was free, and the realization settled in her chest like a weight being lifted. She wasn't returning to what had been. She wasn't asking for permission, for forgiveness, or for recognition. She had no more space to fill in this life. As she stepped outside, the door closed softly behind her, a simple act that carried a world of meaning. She was no longer bound by the family, no longer defined by the roles they had given her. She had let go, and in that letting go, she found herself. She walked down the path, the world before her still uncertain, but filled with possibility. There was no looking back. No more trying to reclaim a place that had never truly been hers. The change was complete, and it was her choice. It had always been her choice. What do you hold on to in your life? And what do you let go of to find your freedom?